Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Maya, and I'll be one of your hosts today. The flowers are beginning to bloom here in the Pacific Northwest, which means spring is starting in Oregon. We hope you're enjoying the version of spring you're currently in, and invite you to spend the next 30 to 40 minutes exploring another new subject, Canadian labeling regulations. With the changes happening in the U.S. market, Health Canada has worked to align their efforts in many ways with the U.S. and also create their own standards for Canadians to more readily understand nutrition fact tables on their products. I'm sure most of you are old hats in Asha History by now, but for those who need a little refresher, we've been around since 1981. We were founded with the goal of creating a complete nutrient database with few missing values. Now, that very term may be something you've heard and disregarded in the past. However, that one thing still sets us apart from many nutrient databases today. Our solutions include packaged good, restaurant, supplement, and nutrition labeling software. When the NLEA regulations were released, Asha was well poised to provide a solution to the food industry, and so Genesis R&D was born. Its functions were derived from the need for customers to analyze menus and recipes, and grew into a tool to develop products, use our reports as audit trail tools, and build nutrient content claims. Genesis can also build compliant ingredient statements without you having to break out that Excel doc. Ask us how. Some upcoming webinars. Believe it or not, there's more where this comes from. On April 11th, we'll focus on the new restaurant menu labeling regulations, which go into effect in May. Our restaurant specialists will present on the regulations and discuss best practices when documenting your menu labeling needs. After that, we'll take a chance to focus on Asha Port, which is such a useful utility. In light of all the recent changes, there is increased demand for our ingredient suppliers to provide updated nutrition information to their customers. So many of our customers have asked for the ability to import bulk data from a supplier who also uses Genesis. On May 16th, join us to learn more about all the amazing features Asha Port now offers. And lastly, just after Memorial Day, we'll have a webinar on added sugars. Today, we will focus on the new Health Canada changes that have affected the Canadian Nutrition Facts table. We'll break the presentation up into the following areas: an overview of the changes, including timeline for compliance, the new label format, as well as the exact nutrient changes that have occurred. This will focus in such things as RDI changes on core nutrients, as well as a major change to how sugars are to be declared on the label. There have also been changes to serving sizes as well. The second half of the presentation will focus on Asha's response to these changes and the new features released in Genesis 11.3 that help you navigate the new regulations for products sold in Canada, including how to transition a current product to be in compliance with the new Canada Health regulations in terms of food labeling. The timeline for compliance. Unlike the US, Canadian companies or those selling into Canada will have 5 years rather than the 1 to 2 to make the transition. Also different than the US, all companies, regardless of annual food sales, will experience the same end date for compliance, which is December 14th, 2021. We can expect to see both the old and the new nutrition fact table throughout that transition period. Here's some visuals of the old versus the new label. As in the US, calories are much more pronounced, as well as serving size. Percent DV values have also been updated. So you can see here this product although containing the same 250 milliliter serving size, has different percent DV values. Most notably, sugars actually have a percent DV now, which you can see on the previous nutrition fact table it did not. The minerals shown at the bottom of the panel have changed, and we also see a footnote change as well. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the key changes, some of the things I just went over. We see those spelled out here. So certainly the calories are larger, the serving size up here is more declared. Some of the nutrients have changed. And in addition to these changes, we've also been changes to the ingredient statement and the allergen statement, hoping to have improved legibility for ingredients and allergens, as well as grouping the sugar-based ingredients together. So here you see we have sugars, open parentheses, fancy molasses, brown sugar, and sugar. Let's dive deeper into the nutrient changes. In Canada, nutrients that are required or mandatory are referred to as core nutrients, and those that are voluntary are referred to as additional labeled nutrients. This is different than the US. There have been changes much like in the US to many of these nutrients. potassium, which is now a core nutrient, has been increased from 3,500 to 4,700 milligrams. Dietary fiber has also been increased from 25 to 28 grams. Iron, another core mineral, has been increased from 14 milligrams to 18, which means your nutrition fact table could show different percent DV values for the same product simply because these values have been updated. This change comes as a response to what would best suit the population in terms of nutrient needs. There have also been some decreases in terms of percent DV, including sodium from 2,400 milligrams to 2,300. That is the only core nutrient whose daily recommended values have been decreased. The rest of these are considered additional label nutrients, but many have been decreased, such as many of the B vitamins, including niacin, riboflavin, thiamine, and pantothenic acid. Sugar, as mentioned previously, is a core nutrient that didn't previously have a daily recommended intake, which is now set at 100 grams. Here we discuss vitamin A, which no longer is a core nutrient, but an additional label nutrient. The unit change from RE to micrograms RAE may mean we need to convert old values to new values. 1 RAE is equal to 1 microgram of retinol, and 1 RAE is equal to 12 micrograms of beta carotene. So we have to know the source of the vitamin A in order to make the conversion. And these conversions reflect more accurately the conversion of carotenoids to vitamin A in the body. Folate, another additional label nutrient, has also seen a change in units from micrograms to micrograms DFE, which stands for dietary folate equivalence. Here is the conversion Asha uses. 1 microgram DFE equals the food folate micrograms plus 1.7 times the folic acid micrograms. So the actual folate amount coming from the food plus 1.7 times the amount of any added folic acid. Single serving containers have also been updated as per the new regulations. Luckily, as opposed to the US, we don't have to worry about dual column containers in Canadian nutrition fact tables. However, as an update similar to the US, if a container contains up to 200% of the Canadian reference amount, that container should be considered 1 serving on the label. An example we have here is in regard to a carton of milk. The serving size is 1 cup, which is 250 mLs. However, because the carton is 273 mLs, this puts it into the single serving container scenario. Ingredient statements have also been updated. So here, let's take a look at it. We must use proper case, which means the first letter of each ingredient is capitalized and the rest of the word is in lowercase. Ingredients can be separated by a bullet point, as we see in the image, or a comma. The sugars must be grouped together, showing sugars, open parentheses, and list the first sugar by weight, then the second sugar by weight. Ben will show later how we can approach this in Genesis. As for food additives and colors, there have also been a change. Previously to this regulation, manufacturers had the option of simply showing the word color as the common name for declaring added food colors. However, when Health Canada changed the food and drug regulations, it meant that food colors have to be declared by their common specific name. Here we see Allura Red. And the same holds true in terms of making the allergen statement more legible, and we can also separate it using the bullet points or a comma. Let's talk about what is defined as sugar according to the Canadian regulations. So unlike the US, where the change has been to focus on added sugars specifically, we don't have that nomenclature in regards to the Canadian labels. Here we define sugars first, and then we'll dive into how that reads on the label. Examples of sugars in terms of Canada are white sugar, beet sugar, agave syrup, high fructose corn syrup, and fruit juice concentrates. So sugar on the ingredient statement, we can tell that they need to all be grouped together. Here we see the original version where the sugars were spaced out amongst the ingredient statement. And now we must declare all of the sugars grouped together, open parentheses, listed them out by a comma. Those we cannot use a bullet point if it's within the parentheses of the sugars. Serving sizes have been modified to be more realistic in terms of what Canadians are consuming, and all of them have been made to be more consistent. You can see in the top image here some bread nutrition fact tables that may have been based off of one slice, where another nutrition fact table for bread is based off of 2 slices. This is obviously hard for a consumer to compare the nutrition value because the serving sizes aren't the same. So in the new scenario, we now have the serving size for bread based off of 2 slices, which will allow the consumer to compare nutrition for sliced bread in hopes to choose the right item for them. 2 slices, 2 slices. I mentioned the new footnote. Let's talk a little bit more about what it means. So Health Canada wants you to know how to identify foods that contain something like a lot of sugar, for instance. By adding a % daily value for sugars and a footnote that allows consumers to know what 5% DV means and versus what 15% means. So we're told at the bottom here that 5% means 5% or less is equal to a little, whereas 15% or more is equal to a lot. This is a different approach than the US takes, but is a way of informing Canadians how best to choose packaged food products in order to make healthier food choices. Genesis, of course, implements this for you. Something like sodium would be a nutrient we would want to limit, whereas calcium might be something we would want to see above the 15%, showing that this would be a source of calcium, providing more of a good nutrient. Here are some images, and Ben will go over this in more detail, but I wanted to show you a little bit about what Genesis can produce. So here are some of the different nutrition fact table formats that we have: the standard, the tabular, bilingual. We have an aggregate area. We also have an area which Ben will show in regards to sugar. So he will dive into how Genesis 11.3 accounts for sugar items in the ingredient statement. Lastly, Ben will also talk about the auto calculator, which could help us convert nutrients. At that point, I'm going to hand it over to Ben to show us a little bit about Genesis.
Great, thank you, Maya. And so we're going to take a look at Genesis. As Maya mentioned, the current version of Genesis that's required for the new Canadian label is version 11.3. If you have any questions about how to get that version, or if you're eligible for that version, you can contact our sales team. We're going to take a look at our preferences and some ingredients and some recipes. To start with, we're going to look at the preferences of the actual Genesis application for the global option for your regulation. So within the preferences, you can select the different countries that you'd like as your default. This will select the percent DVs when you're looking at reports and looking at your ingredients, and it will also show the default label when creating a new recipe. So I'll change this over to Canada 2016 for our regulation. We'll go ahead and hit OK. We'll go ahead and open up an existing ingredient now, and we'll take a look at some of the changes that have been made for the Canadian regulations. Oh, I'm sorry, I actually skipped something that I was going to show. Let's go back. The other preference that we have that we've changed is going to be our nutrients to view. Nutrients to view are the nutrient sets that are shown within our reports and within our ingredient. We have added in a new Canadian label 2016 mandatory and all. Mandatory will of course show those core nutrients, and then all will show the core plus the optional nutrients that can go on a label. I'm going to use a set that I've created specifically for this webinar, but you can switch them back and forth between the Canadian label mandatory, which is the 2003 regulations, and then the 2016 regulations as well. Going back over to that ingredient that we were looking at. Under the nutrients tab for your ingredient, the percent DV area at the top here will say percent DV based on Canadian label standards. If you choose the 2003, then it will say based on 2003 Canadian label standards. Taking a look at the one major change for the new Canadian regulations is going to be the way vitamin A is measured for Canada. Previously it was RE, now it is RAE micrograms. We have two different ways to convert that. If you have all of your data entered in as an RE and you'd like to convert that all to RAE, you can either enter in your RE. This is more generally for a new ingredient that you're entering in. So if you have your RE value from your spec sheet and you have, say, 50 RE, So long as you have your auto calculations checked on here, which I'll go ahead and do now, if we enter in a value for our RE, it'll ask us if we would like to calculate that nutrient for our AE values. You do have to know if it's an animal source or plant source, but so long as you do, you can click on that and say OK. It will also ask if you'd like to convert it to IU, which is the US measurement for the old label for vitamin A. And the other option that you have is you have a calculate nutrients button at the bottom down here. For existing recipes or existing ingredients that you have, if you'd like to just calculate the vitamin RE value, you can click on the vitamin A RE, calculate, and say that it's from the RAE. I'll calculate that number across. The other big change that we've done to ingredients for the new version of Genesis to support the new Canadian regulations is under the ingredient statement tab. So we click on ingredient statement area here. At the very bottom of this window, we see Canadian options, and there's a check mark for is sugar. So if this is unchecked, then any ingredient that is checked for is sugar, so long as the label in your recipe is selected to the 2016 regulations, that item will be added into your ingredient statement area of sugars. And we'll go over that in just a moment. I'll go ahead and close this ingredient and open an existing recipe now that I've created for this presentation. The Canadian webinar example. Open up this recipe and then take a look at the label. And then I'm also going to go ahead and go into open a advanced label that I've created. And that's going to be a 2003 label of this exact same recipe. So we can look at the differences here that we have. As Maya had kind of pointed out during our slideshow, we can take a look at the differences between a 2016 label, as we see on the right side here, and then a 2003 label, as we see on the left. So on the right side, we're not seeing vitamin A and vitamin C. On the left side, we have it. Some of the percent DVs have changed. And you can do that just by creating an advanced label for your existing recipes in the Genesis application. We're going to go ahead and close out that 2003 label and move over into just our new label now. We'll take a look at some of the ways we can edit these labels. So when you have your existing recipes in Genesis that you want to switch over to the 2016 regulations, you'll want to go into Edit Label, and under the General tab, you have your category area here. Nutrition Facts 2003 is what all existing recipes will be set as when you install that new update. And you'll have to change all of those over into the Nutrition Facts without a year, which is the 2016 regulations. So we go to 2003, it's going to be the old regs. Nutrition Facts by itself is going to be the new regulations as we see. If you're wanting to take a look at the other styles of labels you have, under the label option, you have adult, infant, and child options. Style, we have the standard, tabular, and linear, just like the old regulations. We have them for the new as well. And for the format, you can do a full or simplified label. And of course, just like always, you're always going to need bilingual options, so you have to check that in the format options. Generally, for any existing recipe, you'll have that checked off, or you can set it as the default in your settings. All right, the biggest other change that we have made inside of Genesis, as I mentioned before, is going to be the ingredient statement area. Going into our ingredient statement box up here, we now have a new column on the far left side of our ingredient statement area that says is sugar. This will only exist if your label is set to 2016. So if I close this window out, go back into Edit Label, and change this to a 2003 Nutrition Facts from Canada, or if I do anything from the United States. If we go into ingredient statement, that column will no longer exist. So this only applies to the new labeling regulations for Canada. Let me switch it back really quick here so we can actually get working on that. In our ingredient statement area, you have these checkboxes that say is sugar. This is the same checkbox as if you were to open the ingredient itself. And it will update at the ingredient level. So if I check this box, say I have my sugar that's white granulated that I've added into this recipe that I don't have is sugar checked, but it probably should be because it's granulated sugar. Go ahead and check this box. And now as we see in the ingredient statement at the bottom here, we have sugars, parenthesis, sugar in our ingredient statement. And again, like I mentioned, as soon as I hit OK with this item, it's going to automatically update our sugar ingredient at the ingredient level. So if I right-click on this item and say open the actual ingredient itself, under the ingredient statement tab, we now see that it's checked as is sugar, which it wasn't before we started this. So it's a great way to bulk update all of your ingredients that you need instead of just having to update one at a time. The next thing that we'll take a look at is some of our reports. We have the spreadsheet report, which, as our nutrition team always likes to point out, is by far the most important report that we'll look at for your formulation. As you're looking at it, you can take a look at the vitamin A, RAE, and RE values. If you switch over your label from 2003 to 2016, and you notice that maybe your vitamin A dropped from a 50% area into a very low area and doesn't seem right, you can take a look at the spreadsheet report and show both of those values to see if maybe your RAE value has some double dash areas, which would denote that it has a blank value or an undefined value. So maybe you have to go into your ingredients and update those values, or use the nutrient calculator to automatically convert those over into the new way to measure that.
Thanks, Ben. That was a great run through of all of the awesome features of 11.3. Let's finish up with a little bit of a recap of things to consider when you're using 11.3 and transitioning your products. So first of all, do you have the latest version of Genesis? You can check this on the home page by clicking the About icon. There's an I there. So if you're not seeing those new features, definitely want to make sure you're up to date with that. You can contact sales@esha.com if you have any questions, or if you'd like to add the Canadian feature or module, you can also contact sales. Secondly, we need to update our ingredients with the nutrients that we might be missing. So certain things like potassium, vitamin A, and folate. We would need to highlight sugar ingredients so that Genesis knows to group those together. And we can use the auto calculator to convert nutrients as needed. As Ben mentioned, using the spreadsheet to check for missing values is a great thing to always be in the practice of, especially when you're working with new nutrients that we're not previously working with. And then because there have been some reference amount and serving size changes, you definitely want to make sure that none of your products, or if they have been affected, that you're aware of that and you're updating your serving sizes as needed. And then check the percent DVs. If you're making any kind of claims on your package, these could certainly be affected with all of the changes in the RDI values. I think we're going to talk a little bit about some training that's coming up. So we'd like to highlight a couple. We have an advanced Genesis workshop coming up in Washington, D.C. at the end of April. In that same week, we actually do have a hands-on, in-depth Canadian-specific training, which will be held in Toronto, Ontario. There's still some spots open for that. A great time to get in and get ahead of all these changes. And then another training coming up would be in May, early May, in Lombard, Illinois. We have a professional Genesis training, and all of our trainings are kept up to date on our website, so take a glance there or email training@esha.com for more information. And now I believe, do we have some questions that have come in, Ben?
Absolutely. If you have any questions, or if we don't get to any of your questions during this, we'll follow up with you individually afterwards, or if you want to contact us, you can give us a call, email us, or you can connect with us via LinkedIn, our blog, or our newsletter. Our first question that we have here I sell chocolates as in an individual wrapper. Am I required to have nutritional information listed on a small piece of candy?
Okay, so an individual wrapped piece of candy, actually that would be considered, I believe it's called a one-bite confection. And if those are sold individually, those are actually exempt from having nutrition information on them. However, if you do have a package which has multiple of those in them, then you would need to have nutrition fact information on there.
Great, thank you, Maya. Our next question, can Genesis put bullet points in between ingredients instead of commas?
No, that is not one of the features that Genesis currently has, but luckily for us, we can also use commas, and that is something that Genesis does. So we're good to go there.
All right, who is responsible for the enforcement of the regulations that have just been released?
That's actually going to come down to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They will be in charge of enforcement.
Perfect. All right, I've seen the term HM and MM listed in the regulations. What does this refer to?
Yeah, so if you look up some information on serving size, you'll see those two acronyms. So HM stands for household measure, which is going to be the common household measure that the consumer can understand, such as 2 slices of bread. And then the MM refers to the metric measure, and that is the actual metric weight or milliliter if you're using a serving size such as that. So we need to have both of those pieces of information in order to have a complete serving size.
Perfect. All right, our next question, which I'll take, how can I enter in French ingredient names into Genesis? And I'll go ahead and show that in the actual Genesis program. So we have 2 different ways of doing that. I'll open up an ingredient and I'll open up a recipe so we can see both ways. We open an ingredient. Let me go to our ingredient statement tab here. We do have separate tabs for the different languages, English, French, and Spanish. So if we hit the edit button here, we can enter in an alternate name for English and an alternate name for French. So if we wanted to type in the name of this item in French, it will show up in our French ingredient statement instead of the ingredient name that exists. The other way to do that, if we close out our ingredient, go into the recipe, we go to the ingredient statement window within a recipe itself. We can alter the alternate names of any of our ingredients directly within the ingredient statement box of a recipe. So if I right click on my item and say edit, we can change the alternate name of this item in English and in French. Just remember that this is a ingredient level change. So you are going to be changing the translation of this ingredient, not just in this one recipe, but in every single recipe that this ingredient is used in. We have a couple more questions here. Our sugar is now going to be the first ingredient in the ingredient statement.
Not necessarily. It's still dependent on the weight of the ingredients. So if when all the sugars are grouped together, if that is the highest percent by weight item, then the sugars would be first. However, if that fell somewhere further down, perhaps in the middle or at the end, the sugars would be placed wherever they need to go based on percent by weight. However, they do still need to be grouped.
Perfect, thank you. And our very last question, which we get quite often, will you send out the slide deck and the recorded webinar of this? And we will. We will send this out after the fact. It should go out today, possibly tomorrow. You'll have a copy of that and it'll be posted on our Facebook page and all of our social media and YouTube. All right, if we didn't get to any questions, we'll follow up with those after the fact. Thank you and have a great day.